My name is Jennifer Edmond. I'm Associate Professor of Digital Humanities at Trinity College Dublin, and I'm the institutional lead for our participation in the CLS INFRA project.
My name is Vera Yakupova. I work for CLS INFRA as a research assistant and co-project officer, and I am based in Trinity College Dublin in the Department of Digital Humanities.
So when we were conceiving of the CLS INFRA project, obviously it's a research infrastructure project, and research infrastructure can be pretty narrow to the needs of a certain group of researchers. And it was very important to us in proposing this as a starting community that we would say, okay, well, we know that there are researchers who are very effectively using these methods and tools, but we'd also like to see, are there wider social and community actors who might actually, should these tools be tuned to their needs, be able to use them? So that's where this task 3.5 came from, was that we would look into the potential of literary studies generally, of computational literary studies in specific, and see if we could find out whether people who were in research-related work, but not based in the academy, and certainly not based in literary studies, would actually be able to use the kinds of tools the project would be building. And it was really quite an interesting process. There were a number of audiences that we defined from the beginning. And from there, we defined also a number of types of use that we might find in kind of an applied literary study. So we had to sort of back up into, from computational literary studies to applied literary studies, because we were getting out of the academy. And bringing those two together and performing these interviews around that, I think, has given us a really interesting view, not just of where computational literary studies might go, but also the place of storytelling, the place of narrative, the place of literature in the imagination of a lot of sectors.
We consulted first some works of scholarly literature and just tried to look into and put key words like applied literature, applied humanities, digital humanities, so some of the terms that Jennifer just said, and tried to see what do we find, what is written about this, where is it addressed, and from there we started pulling out the fields that were beyond academia. And there was applied literature around the fields of policy, consultancy, journalism, publishing, medicine, psychology, and art. And actually, during the interviews, we would sometimes also get ideas, or people would refer, oh yeah, I know that field or that person would be working with this kind of thing. So for example, we didn't know about the field of bibliotherapy beforehand, but we discovered it through one of the interviews. And then the interviews expanded from there. And based on also the literature we found, as Jennifer said, we tried to structure it, and we developed or described 4 models that would summarize or visualize those uses of literature. And the first model would be using fictional narratives as evidence for making claims about the past and present. The second one would be using fictional narratives as a mean to prototype future scenarios and cultures, identities, and technologies, mainly such as around science fiction. And then using fictional narratives to build or access predictive models. And we were mainly inspired by a project that used narratives to try to predict outcomes of or eruptions of conflicts and try to maybe act according to that. So it was funded by a military project, actually. And the last one is using fictional narratives for capacity building. So how can reading literature develop certain capacities in us around empathy or leadership and understanding of certain cultures?
So we talked to a couple of policymakers, and while they were very keen to emphasize to us that policymakers will not use tools that they don't have time to learn, at the same time, there were 2 ways in which they saw literature as being a part of what they did. One was about figuring out what the sort of the cultural temperature was and what kind of policy might be appropriate to what people wanted in a cultural space. And another one was about actually helping to make those policies feel like something that was innate or something that was acceptable to the public. And I remember we talked a lot about, for example, the work around policy regarding the Irish Islands. There aren't a lot of people who live on the islands, but of course the islands are they loom very large in the Irish imagination. So using literature to actually draw out, well, how is it that people perceive islands? How is it that this sort of these geographical edges of the country are viewed not necessarily by the people who live there, but by the people who don't live there, would be a really important bellwether for what kinds of policy approaches would be acceptable. And then you could utilize that literary heritage. I mean, maybe not all of it, because some of it is not remembered very positively by a lot of people who would be in Ireland, but you could draw from it and you could shift that narrative around the islands as being places of deprivation and places of very, grave difficulty towards places of great beauty, places of natural heritage, places of a kind of a wildness and spirituality. So they could see very clearly that there would be ways in which, if they could draw out these themes and topics around islands, they might be able to use those in a way that would be effective both for developing and for communicating policy. You'd be looking at the kinds of words that cluster around these topics of island. You'd be looking, again, you say sentiment analysis, absolutely. You'd be looking at sort of maybe even relationship analysis, what kinds of people, what kinds of things are coming together in these narratives. And also you'd be wanting to ask the question of, well, where does that come from? Is that an up-to-date vision? Are there other things at play here?
For journalists, there are usually two parts of the process of writing articles or developing radio programs. And one is the research part, and the other part is actually the developing or the framing of the narrative. And in the research part, there are also whether you would go for a more explorative approach or a more actually research approach. So we had one of the participants say it would be very useful to have a corpus of literature that could be visualized in some way. So that maybe also through word clusters or through topic modeling. And so to see where are maybe gaps or which topics are commonly addressed around a certain area, so that it would be also useful to know what is the public interest from a certain time or at the moment. How could I write more about this? Or if you already know the topics that you're writing about, then CLS tool could facilitate research around literature and be able to see more quickly, this is what the literature of that time around that topic is, and I can then maybe use it more for like my narrative building. And we had one journalist who is particularly writing about technology, and they would refer back to science fiction literature because science fiction literature has inspired a lot of our current understanding of technology and maybe also our vocabulary around technology. I mean, just even around meta and to the metaverse, or even the way some technologies look, like flashing lights around computers, these all come from initial descriptions of science fiction literature. So being able to leverage the imagery and the metaphors or the language that is being used around technology in literature could be very useful to communicate it as well to the audiences, for them to imagine developments of technologies and the uses around it, and also the sentiments around it, perhaps. That could be very useful for journalists who are, let's say, writing about these topics. So as Jennifer mentioned, a lot of fields said that they were highly time pressured. So they wouldn't have the time to hear a lot of the long descriptions around what these tools are aimed to do and all the theory around it. So for them, it's important to have this very concrete, if this tool, and I would use it exactly for this purpose, and etc. So we kind of tried to, inspired by previous projects, we tried to build a table where it's where we kind of write down the profession. So it's a professional from this field. And then I would need this so I would need this tool in order to achieve that purpose. And we tried to just make it like 3 parts of a table. So it would be just in a few words described that kind of tool to achieve that kind of outcome in my field, because that is a thing I'm lacking, or maybe a thing I would like to speed up in the process, etc. And we hope that this would just be something very concise for people to swallow more easily, especially when they're under high time pressure.